Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma, or those who've experienced violence, and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about sex therapy and survivors. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Yael Rivera. Yael uses she, her pronouns and currently attends Florida State University's Masters of Social Work clinical program. She completed her generalist internship at UCF CAPS, where she developed a love for group therapy. Her approach is humanistic, person-centered, mindfulness-based, DBT or Dialectical Behavior Therapy informed, and interpersonal. She has a passion for working with the LGBTQ+ community, college students, and survivors of traumatic circumstances. So, Yael, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I also have returning Danielle Simpson-Baker. Danielle uses she, her pronouns and is a crisis counselor and victim advocate at Victim Service Center. Danielle recently graduated with a master's in marriage and couples therapy from UCF and is currently a registered marriage and family therapy intern. She is also working toward a dual certificate in sex therapy and education. She provides free and inclusive sex education and advice on her Instagram page, which we will be linking in the description below. So Danielle, thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
As a very brief introduction, I'm super excited to have this conversation with you both. As many people know who have listened to our podcast in the past, following a sexual assault, there can be so many impacts and reactions, such as physical, mental, emotional, social, and other effects following a sexual assault. One way sexual violence can impact a survivor is their sexual health and life, and sex therapy can be an option for survivors looking for professional support. Today, we are going to chat about sex therapy, diverse and common effects that sexual trauma could have on intimacy, and ways survivors can heal and feel empowered. So with that, I'll just as usual, starting off with some definitions here. How would you define sex therapy? What is sex therapy?
Well, for me, sex therapy is pretty much just any kind of talk therapy that deals with sexual issues. I know there's kind of a big misconception that sex therapy involves having sexual intercourse with your clients, or people think that you go to a sex therapist to learn how to have sex. And that is true in a sense. And there are some practitioners who do more hands-on quote unquote therapy and actually might have some kind of intercourse or might engage in some kind of surrogacy with their clients, but traditional sex therapy is just talk therapy about any kind of sexual issue. So it can look like a whole bunch of different things. It just depends on what the client needs in that sense.
I think that's a great definition. I'm glad you brought up that myth too, because from our previous podcast, Danielle, you have addressed that myth in the past where there's this idea that it's there's intercourse happening with the therapist and the client, which is not the case.
Not at all.
Yael, would you agree with that definition?
Oh, definitely, especially because Danielle is definitely the one who does sex therapy. It's amazing that you've accomplished that. But I would honestly just say maybe like an open exploration as well. I think sometimes when people think therapy, they're just like, oh, there's these things we have to do and it has to go this way. But it's really like an adventure with this person who's really open-minded.
Definitely. And, when we were planning this podcast, you brought up, Yael, this term erotic labor. So I was hoping if you could define that for us as well.
So I think of erotic labor just a little bit different than sex work, and it might just be, a nuanced term. But I think of it as just any practice that arouses desire or intimacy that doesn't necessarily have to mean physical contact or doesn't mean that sexual climax is the goal. So I think a lot of times when people think of sex work, they think of maybe like penetration or physical contact, definitely with the goal of orgasm. But to me, erotic labor could just be intimacy work. It could be an energy exchange. There's like so many different practices that I would define as that.
Got it. And would you say that these are like separate, right? Or are they kind of maybe?
I think they're in the same domain, but just sex work has a very defined view in our society. So I like to use the word erotic labor just to describe practices like tantric massage or different types of domination that might not involve physical contact.
Understood. Got it. And going back to sex therapy itself, I know that we said like talk therapy. So could you give some examples or kind of what could sex therapy look like? And I can throw this question to Danielle.
Sure. Yeah. So there could be a range of topics. Like I said, it really just depends on, what the client is seeking. I've talked to people about intimacy issues with their partners or themselves. Certainly survivors of sexual trauma who experience some kind of barrier with, fully enjoying their sex life, either because of that trauma or just like the ramifications of it. Sometimes there are physical barriers that come with sexual trauma, sometimes more mental. So that's something that's come up in my sessions. Gender dysphoria, coming to terms with sexual identity. All kinds of stuff. It really just depends on like what issue the client needs to work with. But the general theme is that there's some kind of underlying sexual issue that is somehow impeding their everyday life. And that's where the sex therapist comes in, because of course we talk a little bit more in depth about how sexuality really does influence everyday life and how issues with it can kind of take away from a client living their best life, so to speak.
I think that you brought up a really amazing point, I feel like there, where, talking about how, of course, it can also be talking about your own sexual identity, which I didn't even think about as well. And you brought up also the impacts that trauma can have on survivors, and how that this is really what this whole podcast is about. But, while you were talking, one of the common effects, and we'll get more into it, of sexual trauma is feelings of shame. And I feel like our society in general has feelings of shame when it comes to sex at all. And so I think that finding a sex positive therapist can be a helping support for survivors and anyone. So how would you define a sex positive therapist?
For me, I consider myself a sex positive therapist because my goal is always to encourage my clients to kind of explore, embrace, and accept whatever sexuality is for them. So that means if a client chooses to be completely overtly sexual, chooses to maybe watch porn or masturbate, maybe they choose to engage in sex work or erotic labor, or even if they choose to engage in none of that, if they define themselves as asexual, or if they only want to have sex with themselves, or if, if they're on the opposite end of that sexuality spectrum, whatever sexuality is for the client, that's what I want them to accept and embrace and, kind of love about themselves and just explore more about it. So for me, being sex positive is about just encouraging and empowering my clients to embrace their sexuality, whatever it means for them. I think when you hear the term sex positive, you assume that, or a lot of people assume that it's just encouraging people to go off and have sex with everyone, or, be as sexual as they want. But it's not really always about that, because sexuality, I think, exists on a spectrum. So wherever a client falls on that spectrum, whatever is most authentic to them, that's what I want them to feed into and just embrace about themselves.
I love that. And Yael, do you have anything that you want to add to that? Do you agree with that? Would you say the same?
I completely agree with that. I just love that you mentioned like being basically non-judgmental. I think that's huge with being sex positive, is going on that like journey with your client, regardless of where they are on the spectrum or what practices they're interested in, just being really affirming and positive for that exploration for them.
Definitely. And, there could be survivors that are looking to explore their sexuality as part of their healing journey. And it sounds like a lot of the clients that you work with, Danielle, have that similar goal. So why could it be important that they work with a therapist that has this kind of open-minded, sex positive outlook?
Well, I think with therapy in general, like a big thing that we do with our clients is kind of like model to them how to deal with these issues. So I think that having a sex positive therapist who is willing to talk about these things and is willing to kind of hold the client's hand through that journey, I think just having that kind of support in itself can be really empowering for a client. Especially like you mentioned earlier, we live in a society where sexuality is very repressed. Sexual shame is the standard. So just being a sexual person in general in our society is hard enough. So when you are feeling not secure in what sexuality is for you, then I think having a therapist who's willing to help you explore that without any shame and give you a safe place to kind of ask those questions and really dig deep and find what the answers are, I think that can be really helpful and just really empowering for a client. And then, whenever your journey with therapy with that particular therapist is over, hopefully you feel a little more confident to handle those issues, more independently. So yeah, I think having a sex positive therapist can be kind of a catalyst for clients in a way to take themselves to the next level with their sexuality or their sexual journey or whatever you want to call it.
Definitely. I'm so glad that you brought up the term empowerment, and we'll definitely get back to that word as we so often do on these podcasts. So for a survivor that's looking for a sex positive therapist, do you have any tips as far as how to find one, or any kind of red flags to look out for, anything like that?
On a lot of like the Psychology Today type profiles, they do have ways where you can search for different sexual concerns. So you can search for like sexual identity, but there's also kink allied and sex positive on Psychology Today as a search term. And on Therapeden, they also have kink ally and sexual outsiders. So I think like searching for kind of what you're looking for on these websites is like if you want someone who wants to explore sexual identity, or if you're looking for someone who's into kink, or if you're looking for someone who wants to explore maybe like outside sexual practices, I think that could be a good option.
I didn't know that you can have that specific positive one. That's
It is
great.
hard to find on the search. You have to like put it in Google, like Psychology Today, kink allied, and then the search option will happen. But I just think it's a good way to like refine people, but also like talking to these therapists. You're always like shopping for one. You don't have to commit immediately. So I think asking them what sex positivity means to them, how sex therapy goes in their practice is also beneficial.
Definitely.
I completely agree with that. I would definitely say use psychology today. I know that on my profile, selected like all the sex positive related things, like sex worker affirming, all that kind of stuff. So if you like Yael said, if you're able to search that on psychology today, I think that's probably a really good place to start. And certainly, like Yael said, definitely like ask those questions of a therapist, like during your intake or even when you're just on the phone, trying to set up an appointment. Feel free to ask questions like, are you a sex positive practitioner? Like, what do you think about these topics, under the umbrella of sexuality? Because you don't want to invest time into a therapist who's not going to kind of affirm what it is that you're looking for to be affirmed. So yeah, definitely don't be afraid to ask questions. And I think another good source lately is social media. Like if you know where to look, I'm on Instagram. I'm pretty active on Instagram, and I know that a lot of people have found me just by looking through Instagram. And there's a whole bunch of sex positive therapists and counselors who are starting to make a name for themselves on social media as well. So I think if you kind of tap into that community on social media, you'll be able to find a lot of resources as well.
I'm so glad that you both brought up the concept of, you don't have to commit to a therapist. I always like to remind people that, where if you're not feeling it, if you're seeing red flags, if you ask these questions and you don't like the answers to them, you have every right to, walk away and just find another therapist and just keep trying until the one clicks with you, essentially. So I appreciate that you both kind of brought that up and that, asking questions as well. I also wanted to shift the conversation into more learning about some of the effects that sexual trauma can have on survivors when it comes to their sex life. So what are some of those impacts that sexual trauma could have on a survivor?
I think the first one that comes to mind, which I think is common and people think of, is the disconnect between your mind and your body and feeling unsafe in your body due to past threats.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like that's one of the ones that a lot of people don't really expect. And it can be kind of scary sometimes because you might not realize that you have that reaction until it actually happens, i.e., when you're having sex with a person, or excuse me, when you're having intercourse with a person, and you start to freeze up, or you start to get really anxious, or maybe even start to have a panic attack, and you're like, whoa, what is this? And then maybe later on, as you're reflecting, you're like, wow, I wonder if that trauma had anything to do with it. And I think that's another place that a sex therapist can really come in handy for a client, because we can help you kind of piece apart where that reaction may be stemming from, and hopefully even give you some kind of tools to deal with it should it come up later, or should it come up again with your partner or even with yourself. Some other things I've seen happen, it could make people, of course, not want to have sex. Sometimes people go from being, a really sexual person to being completely asexual. Some people can become hypersexual. Some people experience absolutely no change in their sexuality, which they could sometimes believe is an indicator of something being wrong with them, because, I've just been through this crazy traumatic event, but I still want to, go experience other sexual partners. Like, what's wrong with me? So I think there's a whole bunch of different reactions or experiences that someone can have after sexual trauma that can kind of cause them to think that maybe something's a little off.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I wanted to ask you if, through your work with clients, can there be some anxiety that a survivor is, quote unquote, not reacting to trauma correctly?
Certainly. Yeah. And that's something that I've talked about on my Instagram quite a bit, about how it's completely okay to, still want to enjoy sex after a sexual trauma. I mean, I think having a healthy sex life, or quote unquote healthy sex life after trauma, can be a really big part of your healing, because of course when you experience some kind of sexual trauma, your kind of like your sexual autonomy has been taken from you in a sense. So to go out and still want to enjoy sexual experiences and enjoy them on your own terms and define them for yourself can be a very empowering thing for clients. But of course, you know, in our sexual shame ridden society, I think we kind of have it ingrained in us that if something traumatic like that happens, and for you to still want to enjoy sex, maybe that's, you know, there's something wrong internally, or maybe, you know, you have some kind of mental issue because you still want to have sex. Like, wow, that's weird. But it's not weird. It's actually very normal. So yeah, I think that's a big anxiety that a lot of survivors of sexual trauma may end up facing. But yeah, I always try to normalize, and like, it's your sex life is your sex life. It doesn't matter what someone else did, you know, to try and take that away from you. It's still yours, and it's still, you know, if you want to explore that still, you are more than welcome to do it. You have that right.
Absolutely. I love that, you know, at the end of the day, there's no correct way to respond to trauma.
Exactly.
There's just, we don't choose how to do it. And I also love that you're the empowering idea of defining your sex life and your sexuality and things like that. You know, speaking of defining that, I've come across this statement a lot, that sexuality is fluid. So what exactly do we mean by when we say sexuality is something that's fluid?
Danielle kind of touched on this earlier in a much more eloquent way. But to me, when I think of sexuality as fluid, is that it's ever changing. Even if, you know, not someone who's experienced trauma, but just any human throughout their life, that sexuality is dynamic and nuanced. There's just different things we might be interested in our life, and just being open to that change and that it is fluid.
Right. Yeah. I think you said it perfectly. I think it's just that sexuality is, like I said earlier, it exists on a spectrum, and people are allowed to, you know, move either way on that spectrum as they see fit. It's just that sexuality is not a static thing. So, you know, your gender identity can change at any point. Your romantic identity can change. Your orientation can change, even sometimes from, you know, minute to minute, or from experience to experience. I think it's like Yael said, it's more of a nuanced thing. It's not something that you kind of are just born with, or it's not something that you make a decision one day and you're like, yeah, I'm going to stick with this for the rest of my life. Like, no, you're going to have other experiences throughout your life that will more than likely influence that. So I think that's another reason why having a sex positive therapist or influencer, or just someone to talk to have that around and kind of affirm that and let people know, like, yeah, it's okay. You want to be this today? That all right, go for it. Like, it's not a static thing. It can change from experience to experience and from moment to moment.
Again, yeah, I appreciate you both kind of breaking that down. I think that was kind of a myth, right? This idea that sexuality is stagnant, and really, as we're kind of evolving, I suppose, as a society, I love that we're starting to see things are as more fluid as on a spectrum, just like sexuality. And I think that there's some other myths that we've already kind of addressed, where, of course, not all survivors will, for example, there's a myth that all survivors won't want to engage in sexual intimacy after experiencing sexual assault, which is, of course, not the case. Other myths about sex therapy that we addressed as well. But I've heard of this other myth where, like, kink or BDSM is not appropriate for healing. So wanted to see what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I know that we've talked about this on, I think, a couple other podcasts, but I love the idea of kink as kind of a therapeutic practice for clients, because, again, like, when you experience a sexual trauma, especially, you know, it's kind of like a decision about sex has been made for you. So that autonomy is kind of taken out of your hands. Now, with kink and BDSM, I absolutely love it, because consent is kind of like the driving force for pretty much all kink and BDSM based practices. It's all about, having conversations, negotiating like what is allowed to happen during play, what's not allowed to happen, what your preferences are. And it's kind of an ongoing conversation because even during your play scenes, especially when it comes to BDSM specifically, you do kind of have some mechanisms in there to make sure consent is ongoing, but you also do have the power to say, all right, like, let's stop, let's pause, let's adjust. So it's consent is the name of the game the whole time. So I think for a sexual practice to really be based completely around consent can be completely healing for survivors because it places all the decisions back into their hands. So I'm all for BDSM and kink as a healing practice for survivors of sexual assault.
I also agree with Danielle. Like, I love that you mentioned consent. Like, that's my biggest point when I mention kink is it's consent in an environment that can be very corrective. You're like teaching your brain that you're able to have consent and safety in a situation that others might perceive as, maybe a little more risky. And that can be pretty healing for some, is having that control in that situation.
Love it. Yeah, I think that I remember on our previous podcast, Danielle, we talked about how a lot of times there's this idea of the dom and the sub, and where the power really is with the sub because they're the one who is consenting and making the choices of, I'm okay with this, I'm not okay with this. So exactly. I love that. That was just kind of echoing as we were discussing.
Right. And I always like to say that like a sub is only a sub, or excuse me, a dom is only a dom because the sub allows it. If the sub said no, then that dom doesn't have a role anymore. So I think that's also a really big misconception. People just think that, I don't know, maybe you go online and you're like, oh, I'm a sub. And then you find someone who's like, I'm a dom. Okay, great. We'll work together. Like in a sense, it is like that, but it's not like there's no other, conversation about what's going to be allowed in that dynamic. I think people really miss that point. A dom does not have a role unless the sub allows them to occupy that role. So
yeah, absolutely. And so that's why I can definitely see how, this healthy relationship with consent really, when it comes to intimacy, I can see how that could be really healing for survivors. Another myth that I've heard, and I think that I've heard survivors say this too. For example, sometimes survivors may feel like perhaps, let's take an example, like a man who identifies as heterosexual, and maybe they experienced sexual violence. They were sexually assaulted by another man. They may feel like, oh, does that make me homosexual now? Does that make me gay now? Is that like a myth that you wanted to address? What are some thoughts on that as far as sexual assault changing someone's sexuality?
I was just going to mention that I think sexual assault can definitely change sexuality, but not in that sense. I think just like we've mentioned before, like sexuality is fluid and different things impact us, and it is an exploration. I just think the biggest part of the myth to take out is that it will necessarily change that it will happen. I don't think if someone's assaulted that will change, or that they will necessarily identify as that.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's definitely, I think for whatever reason in our society, we've kind of like conditioned people to think that maybe that's what should happen. But any client I've spoken to, like, especially like my male clients, like I've had male clients who were already kind of like questioning their sexuality, and then maybe something happened and it kind of caused them to question it a little bit more. But then I've had male clients who, like, they had that happen and they knew for a fact that they were definitely heterosexual. So I don't think that a sexual assault is going to just change a person's sexual orientation. I think that if you were already maybe unsure about your sexual orientation, it could prompt some questions or just some reflection, period. But I've never had a client who was like, yeah, I was straight, and then I had this happen, and now I'm now I'm gay. Like I've had clients who were like, yeah, I had this happen, and it kind of affirmed for me that maybe I think I'm bisexual, and then we just explore that. But yeah, I don't think I've ever had a client who's like had their sexual orientation completely flipped because of sexual trauma. If anything, it kind of affirmed for them what their sexual identity was.
Right. Yeah. I think that I've heard of this myth before, and that's kind of why I wanted to address it, because again, it's something that is their identity. And, it sounds like trauma can have effects on certain things. But at the end of the day, how that person identifies is how they identify, and no one can take that away from you, I guess is what I wanted to say. So I appreciate that.
Of course. And I kind of think that, like, I don't know, I feel like I said, we just live in a society that really like vilifies people for being homosexual. So I think that it's more of like, I don't know, it just kind of is a questioning thing for people sometimes, or for men especially. It's like, well, geez, this happened. Like, does this mean I'm gay? But then I think when they really start questioning that, and they really kind of like, reflect on what their identity is, they'll kind of realize, like, just because this happened, that doesn't mean that I change my sexual orientation. Like, I think something like that can kind of prompt the person to really figure out who they are. And like I said earlier, just kind of like affirm that, like, it's, I think that speaks more to like society's idea on LGBTQ people, and like what it means to be gay, and what it means to be fluid in your sexual orientation. I think that's more of a commentary on like society's idea of that, or like what society wants us to think about that. Does that make sense?
It does. I think also that's a really good point as to why people need a sex positive LGBTQ affirming therapist. Because like the way that you explain that is like, this is an exploration, like we need to kind of figure out what this means for you. And that has to be done non-judgmentally.
Exactly. Yep.
So yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And we've been talking a little bit about, sexual intimacy in the sense of it being kind of this healthy thing. So, and I've heard a lot where this term of healthy sex life. So how would you actually define what a healthy sex life is?
I mean, for me, it's whatever is healthy to the person individually. Like, there's no like set limit or, amount of times you should be having sex a day, or amount of sex partners you should be having. Like, it's whatever healthy means for you. And I think that's another place that having someone who's sex positive as a therapist comes in to play, because like we said earlier, like a healthy sex life, or excuse me, a sex life period, that could include having sex with a whole bunch of different people. That could include not having sex at all. So if that's what you deem healthy for you, then that's what you go ahead and do. I think a sex life becomes unhealthy when it is hindering your everyday life, and when it's taking away from you, making sure your responsibilities are fulfilled. So like if you are, not paying your rent, or if you are not going to work, or you're, not nurturing your social relationships, or, you're not talking to your family because of your sex life for whatever reason, then at that point, I think it's unhealthy. But other than that, I don't think there's really like a definition. It's whatever is healthy for the individual.
I love that. And I would assume that it would be the same for a survivor of sexual trauma, what a healthy sex life can look like to them, kind of how them defining it. And we talked about how, why it's important that a survivor determines that a healthy sex life is, how they define it, bringing in that empowering piece that we're kind of talking about over and over again. So, and we've already kind of discussed how survivors already face shame, and society putting shame on those that are sex positive. So do you think that, in a sense, a way for survivors to reject shame that is put on them and embrace their individuality and healing is kind of exploring and defining what a healthy sex life looks like to them?
Absolutely. it's that journey, kind of making meaning of what they've gone through for their life. But like Danielle said, it's really up to them. It's like, what does this mean to you? What's fulfilling and happy to you?
I love that. And maybe a survivor, what would you say to a survivor really who wants to be intimate, who wants to explore their sexual intimacy, but maybe is having trouble with trust or is nervous about triggers?
I would definitely encourage the survivor to talk to a therapist, like talk to one of our therapists or find another sex therapist for sure. Some tools that you can probably use are just trying to establish like what a baseline is for you as far as intimacy, like what kind of touches are you okay with? Number one, what does intimacy look like for you? Because it's not always about physical touch. Like it could just be spending time with yourself or spending time with a loved one. I think another misconception that we have about sex is that it has to be physical, that it has to involve intercourse, that it has to involve penis and vagina intercourse. And that's not the case. I think sex can have a lot of different faces, a lot of different methods. So figuring out like what sex looks like for you, especially after trauma, if it is more of a physical thing and you're having issues with trust with partners specifically, you can start by exploring with yourself. I always encourage masturbation just to explore and kind of set that baseline and find out like what you are like and what touches you can tolerate. And really be mindful about that exploration when you're doing it with yourself. Notice like what is happening in your body when you're touching yourself in different areas, especially if there was trauma centered around a certain area on your body. Be really patient with yourself. Find out like what reactions you have with yourself. Write them down if you want. And then take that to your therapist if you want to and talk about it. Like, this is what I feel when I do this. This is what I feel when I do this. And see how, like, what it takes for you to get past that. I mean, I would also say be really patient with yourself because this is not something that you're going to just solve overnight. Sometimes it takes years for people to feel at home in their body again, let alone being able to invite someone else into that home. So don't feel like you have to, rush this process because I think that's going to cause you to backtrack more than anything. But yeah, I think that's a really good place to start. And if when it comes to being with a partner, don't feel like you have to rush into sexuality right away. Like I said, like intimacy and sexuality, it can look very different for different people. So you could even experiment with just engaging in intimate activities that don't involve any kind of touch, or it just involves being together and kind of working back up to that kind of physical sexual touch with your partner. But yeah.
I appreciate that. I'm so glad that you brought up the fact that it does not happen overnight because, yeah, healing takes time. And I just appreciate that you are giving that person that space of, hey, it's very normal to have these reactions and responses that you're experiencing. And it doesn't mean that you're going back. It just takes time and being patient with yourself. So I really appreciate that. And, Danielle, you brought up something about, touch and kind of getting back into that. And Yael, earlier you brought up the term tantric masseuse and tantric massage. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that could maybe be used as healing to get used to touch again?
Yeah, so I mean, it is definitely a practice that I would say might be considered taboo, might be a little bit hard to find. But when I think of tantric massage, I think of kind of like an energetic practice. Doesn't necessarily have to involve touch, but it is usually like touching and getting used to safe touch again, with this idea of healing and like I said, energetic practice. It doesn't involve climax. It doesn't involve penetration. Like Danielle said, like there's so many different ways to explore that intimacy. And I think tantric massage can be an option for some, especially if you don't necessarily want to do that with your partner. It can feel a little like anxiety ridden. Might be you're like trying to perform for your partner. And in this space, like you're in control. This person's there to help you and they're there to like help you feel safe. So I just think it's a good option for some who might be wanting to have safe touch.
Definitely. I appreciate you breaking that down. And we talked a little bit about how like a therapist can kind of help a survivor, who is looking for support as they explore their intimate sexual life after a traumatic event. And one of those things could be figuring out how to communicate boundaries and triggers with their intimate partners. So do you have any tips for survivors, or how can a therapist actually help survivors through this communication?
Yeah, I think that's another thing that I love about therapy, that it provides a safe space to kind of practice different scenarios. So maybe that's something you can discuss with your therapist, like going over some kind of role play. Like, this is what I would want to talk to my partner about. Like, what are maybe some scripts that we can go over, or possible scenarios that we can go over, just to kind of practice it here in the safe space in the therapy room before I bring it to my partner. Because that is such a tough conversation to have. And I mean, there are many different ways that the conversation can go, but I think practicing it with your therapist can kind of prepare you for different outcomes, because you may not always get the outcome that you want, unfortunately. So I love the idea of kind of like a script role play with your therapist. And then also just like, talking about different techniques, grounding techniques, especially when it comes to feeling triggered during intercourse, because there's all different kinds of things you can do. Like Yael mentioned, the tantric massage is a really great option. There's also something called sensate focus. And I love that Yael mentioned the idea of feeling like you have to perform when you're with a partner, because I think that's another thing that society has kind of conditioned into us, that sex is more of a performance and not an experience. And I wholeheartedly believe that sex should be an experience and not a performance. So that's what I love about sensate focus, is because the idea of it is basically to, kind of go through, sexual touches and stuff like that, like experience it, but don't put emphasis on orgasm or finishing or reaching a goal. You really are just trying to touch and experience your partner, experience yourself, just for the sake of pleasure. So when you are touching each other or touching yourself, you're focusing on what feels good, and that's it. So like, if you feel like you find your mind wandering, you go back to what feels good. Like, if you notice that you have a good feeling, like, anywhere, it could be on your arm, then you focus on that feeling right there on your arm. You just bring yourself back to that pleasurable feeling, which is one of my favorite practices, because it also promotes mindfulness, which can be really great for anxiety. So it's kind of just a really great way to get back in touch with your body, that I always like to recommend for my clients when they're at that point to handle that kind of touch again.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the word mindfulness, because as you were speaking, that was the word that I was thinking about, kind of bringing a person back into the present, which can be really grounding, right, for survivors of trauma. Is that right?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, because obviously, if you go through trauma, you may feel maybe an out-of-body experience or disconnected with the body, where mindfulness can kind of bring you back. So yeah, I didn't even think of that piece to it too, when we talk about sexual intimacy and things like that. So, communicating boundaries and triggers with intimate partners, a therapist can help with that. And I think that there's this idea that that survivors may have to disclose their sexual trauma. So do you think that a survivor has to disclose their history of sexual trauma or their story with their intimate partner?
I don't believe they have to, unless it's something that they feel like is important for their journey. I'm a big proponent of your vulnerability is sacred and you should give it to safe spaces. So if this person feels safe and it feels like it's important for them to know because there's a part of your journey you want them to go on with you, then I think it's good to have that conversation. But I think a big part of sexual trauma is it's not your whole identity. It's not who you are. So it doesn't have to be the first thing that you say to someone that you're going to be intimate with. So it's really back to our fluidity and exploration themes that we're going with. It's like it has to feel right and good for you.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think there's ever a time that a client or a survivor should feel forced to share that. I think that if you feel it would be beneficial to the relationship, then you go ahead, and or if you feel like you just want to share that with your partner, if you want to let them in on that piece of you, then you go ahead. I think there's something else to note that like you may never feel ready to share that with a partner, and that's okay too. But if you feel like it's something that needs to happen, then again, I feel like hopefully you'll feel comfortable enough to bring that to your counselor if you have one. Or that's another reason to maybe even seek a counselor's guidance, because if you feel like you want to have that conversation with your partner, but you're not sure how, that's another thing that you can bring to that safe space of therapy to kind of go over what that might look like. But yeah, there's definitely never a time where a survivor should feel forced to share that, because that's part of your identity. So if you want to keep it sacred, then that's what you do.
I appreciate that. And do you think that there's a way to communicate triggers? Perhaps a survivor isn't ready or doesn't feel like they would like to share their story with their intimate partner. Is there a way that they can still communicate specific triggers without having to disclose?
I think that also goes back to practicing with maybe a sex therapist of what it feels like to communicate sexual preferences. Because to me, at the end of the day, a trigger can be considered a sexual preference. It's just not something that my body is okay with. That's not something that I'm okay with. So maybe phrasing it like that, like that's not something that I really do, and I need you to respect that.
Exactly. Yeah, like I don't think it has to be like a big drawn out thing. Like I think it can certainly be as simple as Yael just said. Like, look, I'm not okay with this. This isn't what I'm going to allow to happen here. If you don't like it, then kick rocks. Like I think it can be a very simple, matter of fact thing. But if you notice that the person that you're trying to communicate those boundaries to isn't having it, then that's a different conversation to have with that person. And maybe that's not someone that you want to, have any kind of sexual experience with, because regardless of what your experience is with sexual trauma or whatever, the person that you're having sex with should respect your boundaries, period. So, regardless of if you are trying to disclose or not, if that person's not respecting your boundaries, then you don't need to be having sex with that person.
That should be written everywhere. So I appreciate that, Danielle, that you brought that up. And you also brought up that one of the things that a survivor, if they choose, they would like to disclose to their intimate partner, that they can work with a therapist and discuss about that. What would you say, though, to maybe if a client came to you, or of course, Yael, if you have something that you want to jump in on, as far as if a survivor does choose to disclose, but again, isn't sure how or when it's a good time to do so?
To that, I would tell the client, like, you have to kind of have that sense of reflection within yourself, because of course, as a therapist, I can't tell you when is the right time. Like I can only, encourage you to ask yourself, okay, like if you disclose this, what do you think's going to happen? How are you going to handle what happens? Are you going to be okay with that person's reaction, whether it's a good one or not? Because there are people who may not know how to deal with that kind of information and may not want to be a part of the relationship anymore, unfortunately. So I think that's why it's a good idea to have those role plays and to kind of explore, the different outcomes that could be possible from that conversation. And unfortunately, sometimes that might put it in the client's head that, maybe it's not a good time to tell, or maybe I shouldn't tell. And of course, that's where that safe space comes in, because like I said, I can't tell you, yeah, you should tell them, or no, you shouldn't tell them. Like I can only tell you to really explore what that's going to mean for you either way. So I think, there's a whole bunch of different ways that these conversations can go. So I don't want to get into like all the specific role plays right now, but I think it's just important to kind of have, a safe space to explore what it all could look like and what you're going to do moving forward. Because at the end of the day, when you're telling this part of yourself, you're kind of doing this, like you're doing it for yourself to kind of get it out there to see how your partner's going to react. But you want to make sure that you're ready for whatever reaction you're going to get from your partner. So that's why I think it's a really good idea to do this with someone who can kind of walk you through what could happen.
Definitely. And I appreciate, again, at the end of the day, survivors and everyone is an expert of their life and their journey and what is best for them. So I love that therapists can just be that support as they go through that journey.
Yeah. And I love that you just said that, like everyone is an expert on their own life, because I say that to my clients all the time. Like, I'm the expert on like counseling things, but I'm not an expert on your life. I can't tell you what's going to be best for you. I can, give you anecdotal advice or evidence about what I've seen happen. And from there, you can take that and decide what you want to do. But as a therapist, it is never my job to tell you, you should do this. You have to do this, because I don't know. At the end of the day, I don't go home to at the end of the day, I don't go to your home and live your life. We just have this hour every couple of weeks where we check in and you give me what you want to give me and we go from there. So I'm not an expert on any client's life ever. I'm just an expert on what I've been taught in school about how to help clients, navigate their life in the best way possible. So thank you for saying that.
Absolutely. Thank you for shedding light on that as well. I love that. And, earlier on, we talked about one of the many common reactions, and every reaction to trauma is normal, right? A normal response to it. One of the reactions could be that a survivor, and again, sexuality is fluid, so it may not always be this way, but a survivor may not wish to engage in sexual activity after trauma, and they're not sure if they ever would want to. So what would you say to a survivor who is feeling this way?
I would say that it can be empowering to make that choice for themselves. It really depends on the story that you're telling yourself. If celibacy is empowering and healing and it's something that you're choosing to do for yourself, I think it's great. But it kind of goes back to what Danielle was saying. It's like it has to matter of how you're functioning, if that functioning is fulfilling and happy to you. So if to our survivor, that's a happy and fulfilling life, and that's a good part of their journey, then that's great. But if we're questioning it or we're wondering if that fits for us, that's more where we can like explore with a sex therapist. So what are other options, or what does this mean for you?
Exactly. Yeah, completely agree. I was just going to say, if you feel like you're not missing a part of yourself and you feel like you're fine not having sex, and then that's what you go ahead and do. And of course, like you said earlier, sexuality is fluid. So that attitude might change for the person within, the next few years or few months or whatever. But if that's what you're feeling at that present point in your life, that that's what's best for you, and then that's what's going to help you be as healthy as possible, then I think that decision is completely valid, not to, engage in sex or have sex with other people or even with yourself. So, yeah.
I really appreciate that. Again, at the end of the day, it's valid, right? I love that word. Because we've been using even the term healthy sex life, right? Could this possibly be a damaging term for survivors or anyone really who does not engage in sex? Because again, lives can be healthy and full without sex. So how do you feel about that? Do you think that the term healthy sex life might be damaging?
I don't think so, but that's because I have the mindset that a healthy sex life does not have to involve sex. Like we said earlier, like that's where sex positivity is so amazing, because there are people who want to be really sexual and there are people who don't want to be really sexual for whatever reasons they have. Those reasons are valid and those reasons speak to that person's experience. So my idea of a healthy sex life is not always going to match someone else's idea of a healthy sex life. So if for you a healthy sex life means not having sex, then that is a perfectly healthy sex life for that person. And I think that we have to remember that sex doesn't look the same for everybody. So that's why I love sex positivity, because we really do encourage people to embrace what sexuality means for you as an individual based on your experiences. And I can't tell you what those experiences are. I can't, like, all I can do is validate them for you and, you know, let you know that your sexual identity and preference and experience is just as valid as the next person's. So 100%, I do think that the idea of a healthy sex life can be damaging if you have the idea that a healthy sex life has to involve sex. So
I completely agree. I think that's the biggest point, is that we have this like narrative around what healthy sex life means, but it means something different for everyone. And it could mean not having sex. Like there's people who are asexual who don't experience sexual attraction, and that is a healthy sex life to them, is experiencing that.
I'm so glad you brought up that term, Yael, asexuality or ace, because that's different than celibacy. Is that right?
Yes, celibacy is a choice. It's something you can make for yourself. You might, like how Danielle said, like not want to have sex with others. You might not want to have sex with yourself, different things, but it's something that you're choosing, but there is still a sexual attraction or desire. Asexuality, there is no sexual attraction or desire. So I think people can kind of think of it differently when we say healthy sex life. So a healthy sex life to them is not having sex. It could just involve intimacy practices and different desires that they might have outside of sexual desire or sexual attraction.
I appreciate that. Thank you for breaking down those two separate definitions. And as kind of like final questions here, if someone wanted to learn more about sex therapy and sex positive therapy, where could they go?
I would definitely encourage people to research resources. Google is your friend, but also definitely try and use social media as much as you possibly can, because again, we live in a society that is very sexually repressed. So yeah, sometimes it is hard to find kind of more modern resources that are sexually unbiased, sexually open, sex positive, because our society as a whole is not sex positive. So I think it's something that is really kind of being put in the hands of like people, and, you know, not kind of like bigger organizations or corporations. Like you really want to do your research and kind of, you know, ask around, try and tap into the sex positive community, especially on social media, because it is there. You just got to know where to look. But I think that if you were to find like one good source on sex positivity and social media, or like a sex therapist, chances are you'll probably be able to find more, because they're all kind of connected to each other, like, especially when it comes to social media. So yeah, definitely kind of like think outside the box when it comes to doing your research, but you have to do your research.
And I'm just going to take this time to shout out once again your amazing Instagram. So that's a wonderful resource for any kind of information as far as like education, sex positivity, sex therapy, all that stuff. So please check out Danielle's Instagram specifically. And I love that. Yeah, I can see how this could be a community as well. So if you see Danielle, following other people or they're kind of all connected. So you'll
exactly.
be in that.
We all know each other somehow.
Exactly. Yael, do you have any kind of sources or direction that you wanted to point people to as far as, where they can learn more?
I agree with Danielle about social media, just because I think a lot of therapists get the opportunity to be transparent there and psychoeducational. So I follow a lot of sex positive therapists. That's where like I've learned a lot of different things, like mentioning like mutual pleasure and exploration and things not being performative. That's all stuff that I've learned from sex therapists on Instagram. So definitely social media.
I love that. And as a final question before we sign off, is there anything you would like to bring up that we may not have mentioned? Or are there any final thoughts or words for the survivors out there?
For me, just that I just want to remind all survivors, your experience is valid. Your experience after your trauma is valid. And if you feel like you haven't found a community that validates enough for you, then definitely come to, Victim Service Center. Try and seek out our counseling services if you need them, because they are free. And yeah, just remember that you don't have to do anything you don't want to do ever.
I love that. Yeah, Elle, is there anything you wanted to jump in on?
Just second everything that Danielle said. Your choices are valid and your healing is valid. And then also just be open to what that means for you in that exploration. So any practices that come up or any choices that you are interested in, to just letting yourself be open to that.
I love that. I think that that's a great place to sign off. So thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Danielle and Yael, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.